Hello, my name is Margot Fawcett, and I arrived as a young bride in 1962, January of 1962. My husband was here to set up a dental practice in Dr. Davies' building, which at that time was at 87 Adelaide Street North, and we had one child, a daughter, who was 5 weeks old. Initially, we lived in a duplex, and in the next few years, we were in a rented bungalow at 95 Pottinger Street, and then we purchased a house at 62 Albert Street North, which had been owned by a T.H. Stinson, who was a well-known citizen of Lindsay who had died in 1965, and it was sold by the Victoria Trust Company, the trustees of his estate, and we purchased the house for $25,000 even. The interesting thing was there were a lot of disappointed people whose bids were all in the 17 to 18, 19,000 area, some of whom had gone to such an extent as to have plans drawn up to remodel the kitchen. However, we had arrived from Toronto and we were used to prices that were a little higher. So we lived happily in the Stinson house, as it was known, for the 50 years that we lived there. There were big social changes going on as far as domestic life and what wives may or may not do. For example, a lot of domestic chores were regimented by the days of the week: Monday wash day, Tuesday ironing, that type of thing. That was all changing, and it was changing because of the introduction of washers and dryers. The same thing was happening as far as the dishwasher. It was being introduced at that time. Not everybody had one, but certainly that was a very popular Christmas gift as far as I was concerned in the next year or two, to receive a dishwasher. So that was a big change as far as freeing up time for wives who were at home. Very few married women were working outside of the home at that time, which was interesting from the standpoint of during the war, particularly in Lindsay. Most wives were working, and the school boards, for example, had changed their rules where a married woman couldn't be a school teacher. They now could, by the time we arrived in the 60s. I curled when we first came to Lindsay because I'd curled through high school and was looking forward to curling again. Having a young child, I joined the business girls, and they curled in the evening. However, after the first year, I was notified by letter that I was no longer a suitable candidate to be curling with the business women because I was the bookkeeper for my husband's dental practice, and that didn't count as being employed in that sense because it was my husband who was my boss. So I still have that letter, and it's been a joke over the years because the women that wrote it were, people that I knew very well, and over the next 50 years. So that changed too. That type of segregation as far as what constituted a working woman as compared to being the wife of. Because as the wife of, you were delegated to or limited to certain social functions that you could be involved in the community, particularly when your husband was considered to be a professional man. For example, coming to Lindsay, it turned out that I was Mrs. Dr. Fawcett, and many older women in particular addressed me that way to my face rather than calling me by my name. I was even given the honor of being invited to pour tea at teas. Fortunately, I knew what was the etiquette involved in pouring tea, but all that's gone by the boards over the years now. Well, in the service clubs at that time, if your husband was a Rotarian, then you were invited to be a Rotarian. You certainly couldn't be a Rotarian without your husband being a Rotarian. Same for kinsmen and kinettes, lions and lionesses, and the lodges were the same. And certainly in the churches, any functions in the churches as far as elected offices or were not open. In the early 60s in Lindsay, women were still wearing hats to church, and gloves. Some were doing that to work as well, not so much here in Lindsay. But certainly when I worked in Toronto in the late 50s, the older women going to offices were still wore hats and gloves. Otherwise, the only gloves I saw on women would be the ones who were elevator attendants in Toronto. They wore gloves. In Lindsay, that gradually changed. Men were wearing fedoras still in 60s in Lindsay. A lot of those clothing, sort of etiquette clothing things, men tipping their hats to women and all that disappeared through the 70s. We all smoked, which has changed dramatically. Smoked around our children, smoked while you were pregnant, if you were a smoker, as did others in your home or your spouse. There was no concern about that at that time. There was no fear, absolutely no fear of any harm coming to any children who were outside, and you weren't there supervising them. As the mother, you opened the door at noon hour and you bellowed their names and hoped that they would appear and come home for lunch. If they didn't, then you started looking around the neighborhood or phoning the other mothers to see if your child was over there, but you weren't expecting them to have come to any harm, and you certainly weren't thinking in terms of someone kidnapping them. The other thing was that there were senior women who were babysitters, reliable babysitters, 25 cents an hour, can you imagine? Again, as parents, you didn't have any qualms about leaving your children, even young infants, with a babysitter, particularly if it was a mature woman who had also been a mother or grandmother. And as a result, our social life as couples was segregated to couples. You very seldom took your children to social functions unless that had been indicated that children were invited. So there seemed to be a lot more partying between service clubs and the officers' mess at the armory, and there was a sergeant's mess at the other end where there'd be social functions every weekend, I think, at least once a month. So Lindsay didn't have licensed, they had beverage rooms with the hotels, escorts and ladies and men only. So it was it was segregated as far as so most of us weren't drinking in bars. Starting in the 70s, there was a dramatic change both in Lindsay, but it was affected more for women because of what was happening around the world, or particularly in North America, women's rights and the social unrest and people protesting. So that even though many of us had our heads in diaper pails and weren't part of all this activity, it did affect as far as certain opportunities opening up to wives in particular. Generally speaking, it changed also how men addressed you, because certainly through the 60s it was all old school. They didn't know how to speak to you. Either they inquired about your children, or there was some sexist remark as far as your appearance or something. But there seemed to be nothing in between, which I found somewhat shocking, because I'd been involved in Toronto as an employee with in a senior position with executives in an international engineering company. I was still reading the business press and following, very interested in multi-million-dollar contracts and whatnot. No man in Lindsay would ever want to talk to me about any business thing, including their own. It just wasn't done. I'd like to tell you about the Victoria County Spring Festival of the Arts. This was started in 1978 and 1981. And Heather Gardner, wife of a lawyer here, was spearheaded this, and I was the founding finance chairman. And this organization was to support local artists and artisans and to introduce local citizens to established artists and artisans outside of Victoria County. So that has morphed now into studio tours all over the province. And the Labor Day Arts Festival, also in Labor Day in Fenelon Falls, is a spin-off of what's started as this Victoria County Spring Festival of the Arts. The Lindsay Public Library Board, my husband had been elected member of council, and while he was elected member of council, it was viewed that it wouldn't be suitable for me to be involved on any municipal bodies. However, when he was no longer on council, then that was fine, that I could be appointed to the Lindsay Public Library Board, which I enjoyed very much. I was secretary there in 1970-72 and chairman in 73 and 75, and then there till 77 as past chairman. So there were 3 4-year terms from 1969 when I was first appointed by the council. So the library board is still is a municipal board, but it operated under the Ontario Library Act at that time. So we had some autonomy from the local council, that's for sure, at that time. There was a mayor, Bert Hick, in the 60s, no, early 70s, I guess. And his council, a number of us from the Festival of the Arts and then continued with the library board, but a number of us had been advocating for a public art gallery. And there was a group of artists, like a cooperative artist group, operating out of 8 Victoria Avenue, as they called it, the Little House, and they had started an art gallery there of volunteers and artists exhibiting their work. The council, under Bert Hick, passed a motion supporting the library board's wish to have an addition to the Carnegie building, a 2-story addition, and on the second floor was to be a public art gallery. Working drawings were drawn up, and then the tenders were called by the town for this library addition. The town was going to finance this addition by issuing debentures. And to issue these debentures, they needed approval from the Ontario Municipal Board. Well, this application to issue debentures or to be approved was sitting on the chairman's desk in Toronto at Queen's Park, and while he was out of town at hearings. And Bert Hick, the mayor, forbade me to bug them, I guess is the term, to get that signed when he was in the office before the deadline, because the deadline was the tenders all ceased to be effective as of a certain date. And years later, I realized, like the chairman wouldn't have cared. In fact, they'd probably be happy to cooperate rather than see the project collapse, which it did, because the tendered bids all expired. So that was the end of that for the time being. But I knew from being around Queen's Park that the Department of Culture was going to be was working on having a Ontario grant. These Ontario grants were intended to be used for community centers, arenas, and the fourth one was libraries. Well, when the Ontario grant was announced, then as president of the library board at that, or chairman, I guess was the title, of the library board at that time, we wanted to apply right away, and Mayor Logan, having been a member of council back when Bert Hick was mayor, and we had the first go around with about a library edition, rather than go back to council and start over again, that we would get a copy of the motion of council approving the addition to the library with an art gallery, public art gallery on the second floor, we would simply submit with our application a copy of this motion from 4 or 6 years back, and we got the working drawings out from wherever they'd been stored and applied for this grant. And so council was very surprised when they learned that Lindsay had been awarded a Ontario grant for a library edition. Well, in these intervening years, the Cooperative Artist Group, out of the rented little house, which the town owned the little house, which is where the Chamber of Commerce is now, or the police building, somewhere in there. There are several small houses. And they in the meantime had also been talking to the Department of Culture, I think it was called. And lo and behold, they'd been awarded the status of being a public art gallery because they too had some pieces of art in their permanent collection. And so this created a bit of a problem, and because in Toronto they thought the library board, in talking to them, were one and the same as this other group that were talking to them about having permanent art gallery status. So then behind the scenes, the library board then was meeting with the executive of the artists cooperative, and we each had lawyers, and we were trying to work out some arrangement whereby, which we did ultimately, whereby the Lindsay Art Gallery, the artist cooperative, would manage the second floor art gallery in this completed library edition when it came to pass. What another interesting thing, and of course we're all friends, like we're now divided over this issue, and feelings were very high, and it was further complicated because David Logan's wife, Pamela Logan, was the executive director of the art gallery group. So that added interest. And then I say we had lawyers on each side and working out this agreement. So when you're in the Carnegie Library, the Lindsay branch of the City Library now, you can see the fabric walls on both the reference department and in the art gallery part. All of that second floor was designed to be a public art gallery. The art gallery group were not a municipal body and still aren't, so that they had to continue fundraising to support having staff or apply for grants to have staff. So it's been a struggle for the public art gallery for 50 some more years, as it has been for all other cultural organizations in Lindsay, the theater and the museum. But the Academy Theater is another story. This was also at the same time. First of all, there was the Academy Theater Foundation, and then, which was spearheaded by a Dr. Bill Service, who was my next door neighbor on Albert Street. So after a fundraising campaign and restoring the Academy Theater, and my husband was involved in that, then Dr. Service determined that there should be a women's guild to do most of the work now that it was established. And he got me involved as the next door neighbor. He involved his office staff, which was Audrey Bailey, his reception. In his office, she was involved. He involved a number of OR nurses that he worked with at the hospital, like Mary O. Wetmore and Barbara Truax. So we were the founding members of the Academy Theater Women's Guild. And that was all thanks to Bill Service. Kay Pugh was the founding president of the Women's Guild. I wanted to say something about partisan politics because both my husband and I had grown up in progressive conservative families and were welcomed into the community by the progressive conservatives here. We'd been working in the party all our youth. I mentioned earlier about the lesson learned about Bert Hick telling me not to do such and such. Well, the other thing that came up that sort of turned me around, there was an election going on. And most of our friends, by the way, were active either as liberals or conservatives. So when there was a federal or provincial election, we'd go our separate ways socially, and then we'd be back together, nattering away about politics. I mean, we had that in common. We're all interested in politics one way or another. Anyway, there was a campaign going on, and I was involved with there's three of us, two men. The three of us met with the advance men who came up in connection with a function. The premier or the prime minister was coming to Lindsay, and at 5 o'clock on a weekday, and we three were to met with the advance men to explain what our plans were for them to schedule this event. So it was decided amongst the three of us, with the advance people, that this is a function to be held at the Armories at 5 o'clock on a workday, that anyone coming would be given a ticket which would entitle them to a drink at the bar. So they could have a pop or they could have a beer if they took this ticket over to the bar. Okay? And we felt that would, we all agreed that this would be a draw as far as people coming from work to the Armories before they go home for supper. And anticipating that most of them would be men, because most women would be at home still getting the dinner and with their kids. So I hear from others in the campaign organization that how upset Mr. Frost is, and that I'm to get down there, that he wants to see me. So it had turned out that whether he saw the other two, I don't know, or whether they said it was my idea, which it hadn't been in this initial meeting. But anyway, I'm sent down there like the fall guy, I guess would be the term. So I went down and met with Mr. Frost, and so he greeted me, sat me down, and then sat across the desk and said, "Now tell me about your plans for this function." So I natter away about the problem of being 5 o'clock and people just getting out of work and wanting to have a good crowd for the Prime Minister and the Premier. And at the end of my explanation as to why we, with the advanced men, had agreed on having this ticket include a free beer, he looked at me for a long time and then finally said, "Yes, I think that's a good idea." And so I sort of bounced out of there. Anyway, Les Floss, bless his heart, he stood at the door of the arena and welcomed everybody personally into this function, which was well attended at the Armories, and both the out-of-town campaign organization and the local one were all very happy with the results, including Les Frost. But anyway, so much for those other two guys on the committee. But that was the other sort of key lesson at that point in my life, that like if your idea, like state your ideas and don't necessarily let others talk you out of something if you think it's is worth pursuing. Fleming College was established in the 60s in Peterborough as head office, but thanks to Mr. Frost, Lindsay has a disproportionate number of provincial buildings here, and he insisted that there be a campus of the college in Lindsay if we can't have the college headquarters be here. The interesting thing about the Frost campus, and now it's 50 some years later, since the Ontario colleges were established, it's still Lindsay's best kept secret. Every September or Labor Day weekend, the population of Lindsay increases by 10% in 1 week, and nobody notices. In the early days, they would notice only if you happen to be at the banks on that first, not the holiday Labor Day, but the Tuesday, Wednesday. If you're at the banks, then all the students would be there opening up an account. Now they don't have to go down to the banks. They have an account that comes with them on their cell phones or an ATMs at the campus. So people in Lindsay don't even see them arrive. The majority of those students are a source of income for homeowners in Lindsay who rent rooms or houses or flats to them, apartments. But again, it's sort of out of the public's mind, or they're just not cognizant of that. And they don't talk about the campus either, from the sense that it's one of the largest employers. The largest employers have always been the Board of Education, the hospital, and then the college campus. You don't hear that as much either. They talk about the businesses, privately owned businesses, as far as being the major employers. But we have those three public bodies that are the major employers and have been for some time. The amalgamation of Lindsay and the 16 to 18 smaller communities into the city of Kawartha Lakes is now almost 20 years, and we're finally sort of starting to think as a unit. To my knowledge, the city of Kawartha Lakes is the only city in Ontario whose boundaries are a former county, and in our case, Victoria County. All the other counties in Ontario have been chopped up in making either second tier or new municipalities. Our city government now has dropped the word city and refers to us as Kawartha Lakes. And now, if you wanted me to wind up by saying something about the future, I suspect that the province, and there'll be a move afoot in the next 25 years for us to become a Kawartha Lakes, but incorporate Peterborough County, Trent Hills, into a body known as Kawartha Lakes. And I feel I'm sorry about that, because I like the term City of Kawartha Lakes. City of Lights for Paris. City of Kawartha Lakes is unique. We're the only city with 250 lakes in it, 99% green belt, and I thought that was very exciting, and something I'd be sorry to lose by incorporating even more, or especially when others think there are some more Kawartha Lakes further east of us. So that's my 2 cents.